We have FBC Firebreak launching on June 17th, and this is kind of interesting to me. For one thing, I really enjoy Remedy games. I know they're not the biggest hits, but I grew up watching things like The X-Files and Twin Peaks and Twilight Zone. So I've always been drawn to just the world of the Alan Wake, Control, all that style of game. So this is interesting to me, except for the fact that I like those as single-player experiences that are really more about the story, and if the gameplay is cool too, fine. But this being a multiplayer game is... I don't know. I have question marks about it. Also, Remedy's games have often been graphical showcases. Control was one of the first games where I really felt like ray tracing with the reflections made a big difference. Alan Wake 2 is an absolute graphical showcase. Can be hard to run on those settings. But anyway, so I'm interested in this, but oftentimes multiplayer game and graphical showcase, I mean, some of this looks pretty cool. Do these things always go together, right? So I'm curious how this is going to go. Now, we do now have the PC system requirements, and there's a lot to look at here. So let's take a quick glance. Now, a couple of things I want to mention is, first of all, that I like that while they are including upscalers in the system requirements charts, they're at least being clear about what the setting is. I've criticized a lot of system requirements charts for saying upscaling is being used, but then giving absolutely no idea whether that's quality level upscaling, performance level upscaling. And I would generally assume the worst unless stated otherwise. And sometimes that's led to misunderstandings about how demanding or not demanding a game is actually going to be. So I really like that not only are they giving resolution and frame rate targets, if they are using upscaling, they are saying at which setting it is being used. That is very important here, okay? So there's a lot to like here. I know some people are just going to be upset that upscaling is being used in the system requirements charts at all. And in general, I'm like, they can put whatever the heck they want in the system requirements. It just needs to be clear what it is so that we can get an idea of how hardware will likely perform in the game. Now, will it actually perform like this? Well, we'll need to test it out when it launches, and I'll judge whether that's worth doing on the channel, partially based on your guys' feedback in the comments here, and does this video get a lot of interest? Because if there's no interest in this game at all, probably not worth spending tons and tons of hours benchmarking it. So let me know in the comments, and we'll see. Now, 1080p 60 with upscaler set to quality at low settings, they're asking for a GTX 1070 or a Radeon RX 5600 XT, and specifically stating you will want 6 gigabytes of GPU memory. That's your VRAM. And I like that they are spelling this out. Some games state how much VRAM these cards have, but it's unclear if you actually need that much to run the game. Here, it seems like they're being very clear. This game is designed to have at least 6 gigabytes of VRAM memory. Now, what if you don't have one of these two particular cards? So that's where I would recommend, and I'll link this in the video description, this is Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart. Now, this is not going to be perfect for every single game, and that's really important to understand. Different games perform differently. This just gives you a general ballpark figure for how powerful GPUs roughly are compared to each other. And that's useful for if you don't have a GTX 1070 or an RX 5600 XT. Notice that here you can click on any GPU and it will now set it as the 100% baseline. You can then look at how other GPUs that are a bit weaker or a bit stronger scale relative to that. So here we can see that the AMD GPU they're recommending in the same tier is the RX 5600 XT. It's normally about 15% faster. And while in a GPU review, I might be like, they shouldn't say that those are equal. Here it's more like, remember when you're looking at a system requirements chart, this is not saying you will be averaging exactly 60 FPS at these settings. It's a ballpark. They tested this hardware and it was around 60 FPS, maybe a bit higher, maybe a bit lower. And they're not saying that these two GPUs necessarily average exactly the same in this game. They're saying it's roughly confirmed to be around 60 FPS at low settings with a quality level upscaler. That's what we're seeing here, okay? Anyway, so if you have something like a GTX 1660 Super, that's in a similar ballpark. However, again, you also want to double check, okay, do I have 6 gigabytes of memory? That kind of a thing, because they are specifying that 6 gigabytes of memory. And again, you can click on here and see what the card generally has, but do watch out for cards that had 2 different variants. We have things like that to look out for. Anyway, so if you're seeing any of these cards here, you're a little bit weaker than the system requirements. If your card's up here, you're a little bit more powerful, right? So like an RTX 2060, looks like you are in good shape. And if upscalers are required here to get good performance, at least you would then get DLSS with the RTX 2060 as opposed to probably using FSR if you're on that GTX 1070, which the older versions like you'd have access to on a 1070 don't look quite as good. All right, so it looks like you can at least be on older hardware and maybe at low settings and with upscaling, but still play the game at 60 FPS, which is pretty important for a multiplayer title, usually. Now, the CPUs here I think are going to be important to look at. They're saying that you want an i5 7600K or a Ryzen 5 1600X. Now, these aren't super new or super amazing, but again, what's important to note here is that they're saying that you can get 60 FPS with CPUs like this. So I think that's good, because if they were just saying 30 FPS with these type of CPUs, we might need to watch out. But notice that the CPU requirements here aren't crazy. They do step it up a little bit when they go up to higher settings, and some graphic settings do affect CPU. This could be like, I think we saw in the trailer, for example, you know, there can be a lot of physics going on, and some of that can probably be toned down on the lower graphic settings. So I imagine that there are some things that could tone down the CPU usage, but usually games are just designed around a certain CPU load, and there's not a lot you can do with the graphics to really you know, improve things. So do keep that in mind. But they are saying that even if you go up to an i5 8500 or Ryzen 5 2600, which I'll be clear is lower end than what's like in the like a PS5 or something like that, you should be good for 60 FPS. And obviously going above that is even better. And ray tracing settings, if you're trying to use those, can usually have a bit of a CPU burden on enabling ray tracing. Anyway, if you want to go up to medium settings, it's looking like they're recommending an RTX 3060 or an RX 6600 XT. And that's for 1440p 60 FPS with quality level upscaling. So again, still using quality level upscaling, but moving up to an RTX 3060. DLSS quality at 1440p output generally looks pretty good, and I don't think that's unreasonable for a new game being released in 2025 on an RTX 3060. That's I would say, fairly typical, actually, for 1440p output. So if you were on 1080p, you'd probably be closer to being okay at native resolution here at these settings, would be my guess, although they didn't actually specifically state it. Now, where does that fall here? So the 1070 is the baseline at 100% here. And if we go ahead and scroll up, you might see your card. We're now at the 6600 XT. This is now 32% more powerful. And again, we're moving into from 1080p with upscaling to 1440p with upscaling. So actually, it feels like the jump here isn't actually as much as I would expect, going from 1080p to 1440p at roughly the same frame rate with the same level of upscaling and going from low to medium settings. So actually, I would kind of have expected a bigger jump going up to that these settings, but this is what they're asking for. And again, the 3060 here is at 34%. So it feels like a little bit weird to me there, but that is what they're stating. Again, the kind of thing that might make sense to benchmark when the game comes out. If we pop over to high settings, we're now saying 4K 60, but we're going down to performance mode upscaling. So performance mode upscaling at a 4K output is going to be actually rendering the game at 1080p, but then the upscaling algorithm itself is heavier than just running at a native 1080p. So don't interpret this as what you need to run the game at 60 FPS at 1080p, because of that upscaling having its own impact. We're now at high settings instead of medium. And again, we're at a higher internal rendering resolution and a higher level of upscaling algorithm overhead. They're jumping up to a 3070 or a 6800 XT for this, and stating that 8 gigabytes of VRAM should still be fine. And again, CPU and everything kind of where we were just at anyway. So if I was now setting my 3060 as the baseline, and I was kind of scrolling up from here, we can see that, okay, 3060 is the baseline. We're similar to an RTX 2070, and they did say that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is fine. We're scrolling up, and you got your 1080 Ti's, your 2070 Supers, 5060, this kind of thing. And then we eventually get to a 3070. They're asking for about, 50%-ish more power, and they are stating that the 8 gigabytes of VRAM should still be okay. Now, what if you did want to just max the game out on a 4K monitor, but use performance mode upscaling to make things look nice? Well, now they're moving to an RTX 4080 or a 9070 XT. And they are saying that this is with high settings as well as ray tracing set to high. Notice that kicking on the ray tracing, they have asked for a slightly better CPU. And like I said, I do think this makes sense. Ray tracing does have an increased CPU burden generally. All right, they're also asking for a bit more VRAM. So it's looking like to max things out with ray tracing and on a high resolution display, even though you're using upscaling to get there, you're gonna want more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, but they're stating that 10 should be okay. So 4080 or 9070 XT. So that is quite a bit more power. So RTX 3070 set as our baseline, and once again, notice that we are still using performance mode upscaling on a 4K 60 output. But we're going from a 3070 to a 4080. So in other words, and the only setting we're changing is kicking on ray tracing to high. So in other words, what they're trying to tell us here is how demanding is it going to be to kick on the highest levels of ray tracing? And I think the answer is it's going to be very demanding. So 3070 was what was needed. Now we're going to scroll up and you're going to see us pass through a lot of GPUs before we get to a 4080. 4080 is about double the performance of a 3070, and it has more VRAM, and both of those things will be necessary, it looks like, to kick on that high levels of ray tracing. Anyway, notice the 9070 XT is fairly competitive with the 4080, generally a little bit weaker, but not mind-blowingly so, and it can vary game by game, and AMD really did catch up quite a bit in ray tracing performance, as long as we're not talking the heaviest NVIDIA-focused path tracing workloads and things like that. So we'll have to see how it goes. All right, hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Like I said, I'm gonna judge based on the comments and how many views this video is getting, whether it makes sense to put a huge amount of time into benchmarking this game on its June 17th release. Let me know what you guys think about all this in the comment section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.